Digital 410 Productions proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Dodd Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
What's up, everybody, and thank you for hanging out with us on this Monday for another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast. And as always, we want to thank each and every one of you for joining us every week and then calling us and emailing us when we're not around. We love the fact that it annoys you guys when we don't put up an episode, because that means we're doing something right, not because we want to torture y'all. But once again, Jeff is not going to be able to join us tonight, but as always, joining us is the ever so faithful Henry Sledge. Henry, how you doing tonight, sir?
Doing okay. Doing okay. Got the splint off my arm, so it's, moving in the right direction.
Welcome to the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Between Henry and my family, we're simply a box of broken toys. But I'll tell you who's not a broken toy, and that's our guest tonight. Go ahead, Henry. Do the honors. You booked them. Please do the
absolutely.
honors.
We really happy to have our guest tonight is my good buddy, James Scott. James is the author of 5 books, 4 of them on the Pacific War, 1 of them on the Vietnam War. All of them meticulously researched and beautifully written. I'm in the middle of one of them right now. He just has a new book coming out really soon, if not already, called Black Snow. And that's about the B-29 bombing campaign of Japan. But like any rock star wants to talk about his latest album, James is very graciously do it.
I said the fans want to hear the greatest hits.
The fans want to hear the latest album, but James has graciously agreed to talk tonight about his second book, The War Below. And this is the story of 3 submarines that battled Japan. So, Don, I know you've been interested in talking subs, and I had already kind of had wind of the fact that James wrote this book. So I reached out to him, and he fortunately agreed to come on the show. So, James, we're super happy to see you, man.
Gentlemen, thanks so much for having me on. It's good to be with you guys tonight. So super excited to chat about The War Below.
Yeah. Well, I know that's digging deep into the James Scott catalog, but hey,
just all softballs tonight.
Yes. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll lob a slow one for you to get you started. You won the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award, not for this book, but for your first book. So having won that award, I've read several volumes of that series. I know how iconic that is to Pacific War scholarship. I mean, it's a staple of information. Have you read like every volume in that whole series?
Yeah, I've read a lot. I mean, because a lot of guys I know and respect have been recipients of that honor over the years. I mean, Jim Hornfisher, Ian Toll.
Oh yeah.
Just to name a couple. I think that it's an award that's done by the New York Commandery of the Naval Order, and they're just a dynamite group of individuals. And in fact, I'm going to go visit them in September when my new book comes out. That's going to be one of my first stops kind of on the new sort of a promotional tour for the book, is to go up there and have lunch and give a talk there. And it's just, they really have their hands on what's coming out when it comes to, the military and the Navy. And so I think they pick dynamite books. So.
Well, you just mentioned Jim Hornfisher, our mutual friend, James, our mutual friend, Richard Frank. Okay. Mm-hmm. I know Richard spoke very highly of Jim Hornfisher to me. And in fact, one of the cover blurbs on The War Below, this is the most absorbing narrative of submarine warfare that I've read in years. James D. Hornfisher, author of The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. I mean, that's pretty strong praise from a pretty strong historian right there. That had to make you proud.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Jim, I mean, I was just a dynamite individual. And there's pretty much not a day that goes by that I'm not reminded of either the many stories he always shared and or coming across, his work and whatnot. I mean, I was just, literally 2 weeks ago using one of his books, Fleet Flood Tide, trying to pull out a few tidbits in there. Another project I'm working on. So, I mean, Jim was just dynamite. In fact, he, and I wasn't one, he was in addition to being a World War II author, he was a literary agent. I wasn't actually one of his clients, but, when my last book, Rampage, came out, I mean, Jim came up here to Charleston, spent several days with me. I mean, for the book release. I mean, he was just he supported, World War II historians, across the board, hands down. It was just a larger and larger year.
James, I first got introduced to your work on our good buddy Paul Woodedge on his show. And you were talking about, I think, actually the first of, you've been on there more than once, but I saw you when you did your show on Rampage. But then I saw the one on Target Tokyo. And then looking into your work, then I saw that you'd written on the War Below. So take us back to when you were prepping to write a book on submarine warfare. One of the things that grabbed me, you had me right there when you said the USS Drum. I live in Birmingham. My dad's from Mobile, right down the road. Been to Mobile all my life many times, right by the Alabama, right by BB-60. You got the Drum. Now they have it in a cradle. When I was a kid and would first go on it, I think they had it in the water. But I can remember as a small kid, walking through that thing with my older brother, and my dad was still a young guy at that point. And of course, he's looking at it through the eyes of a former infantryman. And I think being enclosed in a metal cylinder 200 feet under the water was not an idea that appealed to him. But why the Drum? Why the USS Tang? Why the USS Silverside? Well, why those three submarines?
Got it. Well,
is that a softball for you?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
That's like a T-ball one, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So no, the submarine war is one of those that I just am absolutely fascinated by it, and I don't think it's gotten a lot more attention in recent years than it used to, but it hasn't gotten the attention that it really warrants. Because it was the submarine blockade of Japan that effectively broke the Japanese economy, so much so that by June of 44, summer of 44, the Japanese economy sort of crosses the Rubicon, so to speak, and begins what ultimately amounts to its death spiral. And that's before the first B-29 ever even lifts off from the Mariana Islands for strikes on the main island of Honshu there. And it's one of those stories where, they don't, you look at books on Midway and Coral Sea and the Leyte Gulf and whatnot. And there are these dramatic sea battles. And so much of the submarine war it's not. It's a war that was fought week by week, month by month, literally year by year of attrition, of just wearing down and grinding down the Japanese merchant fleet, as well as also some of their naval ships, but really just cutting them off and strangling them. And that's the thing is Japan was like, they just learned no lessons from World War I. You look at what the Germans did to England and whatnot, and you think, the last thing an island nation should do really is get into a big war where they can be blockaded. And what do the Japanese do? Boom, right there after. And not only that, they're just a material bankrupt nation. That's the thing.
Right.
Japan is, they can't grow enough food to support their population. They're in the lead up to World War II, their population tripled in size. 85% of that country is mountainous, so they really don't have the ability to grow enough food. So literally, their fishermen are going all the way to Alaska and almost to the Panama Canal just to catch enough food. They're having to import rice. I think about the only thing that they are materially self-sufficient in is fish oil. So it's really just, and so they have to import everything. Of course, the critical things they need are all like your wartime supplies, things like oil, bauxite, rubber. And of course, you just start strangling them with submarines and it just cripples their war. So that's what makes it such interesting. So now why those three boats? And that's a great question because, the about 288 subs ultimately participated in the Pacific War. And so I was going to tell just the story of three. And so, how do you pick which three you want to tell? And that's the challenge. I spent a lot of time just reading patrol reports, reading books on different boats. But so I was looking for different story, each of these submarines sort of could sort of stand in for other boats. For example, the Silver Sides is just, of course, had just an absolute dynamite record. And it had two really terrific skippers, who really represented, Creed Burlingame really represented the early Wild West frontier days of the submarine war, whereas Jack Coy was the much more polished, scientific, engineering-minded skipper that was needed later in the war. They also had one of the only appendectomies
Yes, right there in the. Oh
Yeah.
man, that just made me cringe to read your description of that.
Man, that's such a great story.
So-
How can you not get into that? And
Yeah.
so the Tang represented all the boats that were lost. It also had the great story of Mush Morton and the friendship he had with Dick O'Kane. And then, of course, the drum had the story of Mike Renskoff, the youngest submarine skipper of World War II. And so, each of these boats kind of had a different figurative, symbolic role. And that's what pulled me into those three boats.
When you're
I'm trying to imagine that. I mean, we've all been in jobs where we've followed in the footsteps of somebody before us, and we may have felt the pressure to succeed if that person before us succeeded. And, imagine going on a boat in that era with following a successful skipper that the crew liked, and you have a completely different style, and you're coming in, taking them, into harm's way, which obviously submarines are not a defensive weapon. And you've got to win their popularity and their confidence. I mean, I can't. So when you read about guys like Mush Morton and O'Kane and Renskoff, I mean, they had to have just been gentlemen of incredible character.
Yeah, they were. And I'll tell you, I think one of the most interesting things Jack Coy said is, he came in after Creed Burlingame, and Burlingame had been, wildly successful. And the first thing Jack Coy did, he didn't change anything.
Yep.
Said, we had two different styles. Like I was just going to spend a first patrol or two, figure out the crew, figure out how to do it. And then gradually began to sort of implement the changes he felt needed. And that was wise, because it was. And, the one thing they do have is a lot of the crew members also would cycle on and off. And so submarines are constantly getting new blood coming on board and things like that as well. So within a few patrols, a lot of the men will rotate off.
Yeah. Wasn't there only one main character in the book who really was with his boat, like the majority of the time?
Renskoff. I mean, Mike Renskoff ends up serving pretty much the entire war on board the drum. And so he starts off as this young, pretty much like a lieutenant, as I recall, fresh out of the Naval Academy in his early 20s. And by the age of 26, he's skipper of that boat. And he's the youngest fleet boat skipper of World War II.
Yeah, I was about to say, I thought that was the youngest.
Yeah, and he was just this great. I mean, and he was alive when I was working on the book, and just
really
amazing individual. I spent a lot of time with him. I mean, when I was writing these stories, and he shared personal documents and things like that. Of course, he was at sea when his son was born. I mean, it was just personal sacrifices, but he was pretty much like, he goes, I went from being like the guy that was sort of managing the commissary and, what we were going to eat, the mess officer, all the way up to skipper. So, I mean, he was this homegrown, commander, so to speak.
Did you, in the process of researching that book, did you ever go down to Mobile and go through the drum?
Yeah, no. I spent a week down there actually, and it was awesome. Okay. They pulled the drum out of the water at that point, and which is really a wise thing. And we've been having that debate here in Charleston, South Carolina, where I live, because we have the Clamagore here, and it's the big fears are it's going to ultimately one day everybody's going to show up down at the pier and it's going to be underwater. And so because
kind of like the Sullivans,
so badly rusted, and so he So I went down there, and the folks that were restoring the boat at the time were just fantastic. I mean, they let me on for crack of dawn. I stayed all day, and for reporting on this, I was really interested in sort of I brought a measuring tape and a camera and kind of crawled all over it, took measurements between the bunks and things like that to kind of determine that. And what was one of the most fascinating things about that is when they had pulled the drum out of service and were making it a museum ship, they discovered down in one of the old battery wells where the batteries had been a whole bunch of bankers boxes of
really
and left over from World War II. And these were just an amazing window into what it was like. I mean, they had the receipts, for example, for like how much food was delivered before patrol. Wow. And so you could see that, they were taking out, chicken in 3,000 pound, increments. How many, 1,500 dozen eggs and things of that nature. Because that was one of the things that really fascinated me. Yeah, that was one of the things that really fascinated me about submarines in World War II, because they had to be totally self-sufficient. During that period between World War I and World War II, you had these amazing naval officers and pioneers who sort of revamped. Not only the design of American submarines, but also sort of the whole mission of what submarines were. They were no longer going to be, operating, as coastal defenders around the Panama Canal or ports. These were going to be commerce raiders. These were going to be, swashbucklers. They were going to go all the way across the ocean into the enemy's backyard and sink ships. And so they had to be completely self-sustaining and independent. There's no Costco out in the ocean. There's no Walmart. You if you need it, you got to take it with you. And so, and it became, like a puzzle of how you fit 80 men and all these supplies into this 27-foot wide tube and be able to be gone for up to 3 months. And that just fascinated me.
And to have the foresight to know that, okay, technology being what it is, we are going to be have to surface to recharge our batteries, to refill our oxygen tanks, and hopefully do it at night. But and I'm sure when you were down and doing your measurements, and I'm sure no matter how many times you go back, because I've done some living history events on the SS American Victory. It's a Liberty ship in Tampa Bay. And when you're going down those stairs through those bulkheads, just how small everything was. And now, obviously, I'm ridiculously large at 6'5", but even anybody at a more modest size just realize how confined everything was, how small the bunks were. I'm sure you were researching, so when you try to describe it in first person, how cramped the little area between your bunk and the one above you is. Just everything was just small and compact to fit as much people and material on as possible.
Absolutely. But the amazing thing is and in that time period, the fleet boat, which was sort of the dominant design boat of World War II. It was like a cruise ship compared to the ones from World War I.
And weren't there some of those World War I boats for the first year of the war?
Yeah, we had some less boats, and those things, they were terrifying, and so, the fleet boat was like, it was like going on the Queen Mary,
They're just a little short of shoveling coal down there.
Yeah, I'll tell you. And the submarine service was an all volunteer service, and so everybody that went on board had to they chose to do it. And one of the things I always found so amazing is so many of these men were products of the Great Depression, and one of the things that really drew them there is a lot of them had just these austere, rough childhoods, and one of the things that was most appealing was that if you were on a submarine, you could eat anytime you wanted. They had set meals, of course, but if you wanted a sandwich, you could get a sandwich. If you wanted ice cream, you could get it. And so, they and a lot of the guys will tell you, even though fresh food would run out within a matter of a few weeks, they all would all swear up one side and down the other that some of the best eating they ever did was the food on board those submarines. So, so it took a lot of crafty cooks, and good submarine cooks were in high demand.
Did they do? You said it was an all-volunteer force for the subs. Did they do any psych profiling for claustrophobia and things like that, or was there much back then?
They did some of that, and really the big one was that they practiced how to escape from a damaged submarine, and they actually had a couple of these towers that were about 100 feet tall that were filled with water. One of them was in Connecticut, and one of them was at Pearl Harbor, and they made the men practice getting out with these Momsen lungs, these sort of rebreathers. And that was kind of sort of the main test. If they figured if you could do the diving tube and get out safely, then you had what it took to be on board a submarine. So I think that was about the benchmark that they used for the, So.
And if you're a coal miner from Eastern Kentucky, it helped.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think
not to cut you off, but I'm looking at the Munson lung.
Yeah.
That's a device and a half, huh?
Yeah.
The only way I can explain this for those of you listening, think about the webbed designed ammo carriers. Like you would see them have that vest, the landing vest that they'd shove some of the ammo. Take that and then put two of the oxygen breathers from a gas mask with the hose. Shove that in your mouth and then put on what looks like a nose clip wrapped with a rubber band that's just attached by a cord so you don't lose it. And you're basically there. That is about as rudimentary as it gets.
Oh, yeah. Just looks like we made it in the garage.
We probably did.
So you said they had 100-foot towers filled with water to test it? Tell me, can you describe that process, or is that getting into...
Yeah, no. I mean, they had different depths that they had, I think, 3 different depths that they tested them at to just be able to, you didn't obviously put them in at 100 feet of water to start with. You sort of worked your way up to that, and so and then of course you had to finally pass the 100 feet. And in fact, actually, the tower at Pearl Harbor is still there. If you go there now, and it's got a conference room on top of it.
Really?
It's there, and so yeah, and so that was kind of the. I mean, as medieval as that sounds in your challenges, that was kind of the main benchmark. And I recall one of the guys saying that they had someone had painted mermaids on the walls inside one of the tanks, so that you could see that as you were sort of coming up.
I never knew that's how they train those guys. I mean, that's a pretty. I mean, look, we have a pool here. We got an in-ground pool. The deep end is like maybe 6 foot. Okay. I don't even like to be like at the deep end, for more than 5 seconds underwater. And I start like, okay, I got to get up.
Oh yeah. And I mean, think about that. These guys on board the Tang use those to get off. I mean, and they were 180 feet underwater. So, I mean, they, and generally in World War II, I mean, when a submarine went down, everybody was lost. I mean, it was not, there weren't a whole lot of cases of people getting off, but there were, and they had to use the Momsen one.
Yeah, I found this great website we'll include on our webpage, WTSPWorldWar2.com, along with your episode about Momsen and all the things he invented. But they're talking about he was committed to developing equipment that would allow submariners to escape. See what I did that? Submariners, not submariners. To escape from sunken submarines. He followed 2 tracks. First was the modified diving bell that would eventually evolve into the McCann Submarine Rescue Chamber. And they actually have photos of an early one that is perched atop the USS Falcon in May of 1939. So that's how early they started working on this equipment. It was pretty crazy.
Absolutely.
Breathing apparatus, the M1940 Munson used for submarine rescues. Yep, here's an up-to-date version. Yep, so we will definitely post these on the website along with this episode.
But James, I think I was reading when you talked about your sources for the war below. I mean, when these subs came back from a patrol, they did 32 page reports to kind of detail everything.
They did, yeah. They did patrol reports, which were awesome to be able to work with. They had they sort of breakdowns of all the attacks, which is terrific. I mean, how long the torpedo runs were. They had stuff about the tides, the weather, things like that. And so they're really a terrific window into, and of course they're written as soon as these guys come back into port. And so you can combine that with, of course, the deck logs, which are in the National Archives. And so, which are those 2 sets of documents really create a contemporary running narrative of what went down on each of these boats. So that's kind of your baseline of research to kind of be, chart day to day to day, and then of course on top of that you want to layer in diaries, letters,
that's what I
all that kind of stuff.
That's one thing I jotted down. I was going to ask you, when you're researching these subs, if you found that maybe the crew of one sub tend to have 1 or 2 guys that were a little more pin happy than the others, that provided you with a more personalized documentation of their experience on that sub.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've always found there's always like 1 or 2 guys who just they've got a girlfriend and a mother, and they write all the time, and that's what you're after. Yeah. And I'll tell you, like, I had this great story with the Silversides. There's this one of the officers on board the Silversides was a guy by the name of John Biena, and he had passed away along about 1975 or so. I mean, right around the time I was born, actually. And so I'd gotten a copy of his obituary, and on top of and when I was working on this book back in like 2008, 2009 and whatnot, the drum, for example, was still having reunions. So, I mean, there were lots of veterans that I could talk to and things like that. But I was also trying to find, folks who had passed away. And so I found his obituary, and in his obituary, I got the name of his son. I tracked down his son who was living on Maui. And I called his son out of the blue, and I said, hey, I'm working on this book. It's going to feature your dad's boat. And I know he's been deceased now for decades, but by any chance did he leave behind any letters or diaries or anything like that? And he said, it's interesting you called. He said, last year my mom died, and right before she died, she came to me, and she had a box, and in that box were all of my dad's wartime letters. Wow. You do, hold on to these. Someday somebody's going to want them. And so literally about a month later, this package shows up, and it's got over 300 pages of John Biena's letters. I mean, there were so many letters in there. Sometimes he wrote multiple ones in a day, that I had to like put them all in order. I created sort of a table of contents. And of course I took it to Kinko's and had them bind it so that like my kids didn't knock it all out of order. And a lot of them were written on Silversed's stationery. I mean, and it was all those stories that like you don't find in the patrol logs, that you don't find in the deck logs. I mean, it was like the time that these guys in the torpedo room found these mice. Of course, mice would get on board periodically in the crates of food and things, but they adopted these mice and they named them Juliet, and one day they realized Juliet's gone missing. They have this terrible realization they've accidentally shot her out the torpedo.
So they never knew, right? They never knew what happened to Juliet.
I mean, look, she's going to go, if you're going to go anywhere on a submarine, that's going to be the only way out from the torpedo rooms.
Last Horatio, I love so well.
So they just had these great, and those are the kinds of stories you had, the practical jokes they had about, who got seasick and, the time that the flying fish would land on deck and things like that. And they'd serve them up in the kitchen and all that. So
I just had a very sad realization. Imagine, if you will, 80 years from now, you're an aspiring historian wanting to write a book on maybe a war that happened in the 2000s or maybe, future from now. You reach out to the grandson of a vet and say, hey, by any chance, do you have your father's email archive from 2015? Because no one writes anything down. There's not going to be any photos. There's not going to be any written It's all going to be, hopefully you find a digitized photo on a thumb drive somewhere and somebody backed up a PST file in 1999, and that's the best you're going to get. It's going to be so hard.
That's a good point, Don. I've thought about that too, man. What?
It terrifies me. You're going to get a whole bunch of text messages, OMG, LOL, things like that.
And you're going to have to rely on heavily skewed news clips that are skewed based on the politics of the time. That's basically your reference material and whatever, official logs that the people involved wrote. But the personalized stuff, it's all going to be gone.
The one advantage that you will have, though, is that you will have things, for example, like helmet cam footage and stuff like that of operations that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, I do think there's going to come a day when, like, somebody's going to write just a killer book on the takedown of Osama bin Laden's place in Pakistan, and you'll have that footage, and that stuff finally gets out. So there will be some trade-offs, but I'm with you. I mean, look, I'm a man of the past. I like World War II. I'm comfortable there. I know it. I stay there. And I will say, one of the things I'm constantly amazed at is just how, some of these guys and women were just phenomenal writers, and their letters. They're just,
and their penmanship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was an art. It really was an art.
Well, you think for a second, well, that was their key form of communication. Of course, everybody's a writer. But then you think, now, well, our key form of communication is typing and texting, but all we have is shorthanded emoji, so you still can't make that relation. But how much the English language has changed. And some of the first iterations of this podcast, when I was doing it by myself, I have like 6 or 7 Time Life magazines of the time. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go through and read some of these articles or read some. Just the way the written language was written, you're trying to read it in modern day, and it's when you play it back, it sounds like, is this guy having a seizure? It's like you have to modify some of the language and the grammar to make it palatable to our ears of 2020 or 2018 when I started this. Just the language in and of itself was even different.
Yeah, no, it definitely was. The jargon, the slang, all of that. And so, and I'll tell you, one of the things, the newspapers at that time period were, just a gold mine because, look, your media came and just, radio broadcasts and newspapers. And so, when, you get these accounts, nowadays, and I was a former journalist. As newspapers sort of began to dwindle, the news holes shrank and the ability to do the long form journalism diminished. But back then, during World War II, it was nothing to have these just amazing accounts of battles and landings and all of that were printed in newspapers, and it's a gold mine that doesn't exist now.
What was the documentary that came out a few years ago about the was it And One Came Back or something on Netflix? It was about the major journalist.
The five came back.
Yeah, that was a great little docuseries.
Yeah, and I mean, look at some of these great writers. I mean, that you had that were coming out at that time. I mean, you had big American literary figures, guys like John Dos Passos decided, hey, I'm going to go in and write about what was going on. I mean, Ernest Hemingway. I mean, everybody was going in, on top of just these really terrific, foreign correspondents for a lot of these papers.
And then you got those like Mickey Rooney who came out of it. He wasn't. He was a bomber pilot? No, he was a gunner in a B-17.
Yeah, and he wrote actually a really great memoir about it all. I mean, so yeah.
What got you into the whole World War II thing? I mean, that's usually one of the first things we ask because everybody gets bitten by the bug in their own way. So let's roll back a little bit and we'll get back to your book. But just for the audience, what was it for you? Because I find I always love to hear what it is for everybody because everybody has different lives and different things, but we all get bitten by that same bug, which is why we're all here.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting. So I was always loved history. And so I studied history in college and was going to major in it. And then my advisor said, whatever you do, don't major in the subject you love. So I did English and Spanish instead. And of course, here I am practicing history. But my first job out of college was actually a public school teacher in Japan. And so that was in the 1990s. And so you can imagine lots of veterans alive and whatnot. So I was in this little tiny town on the main island of Honshu. And at night, I volunteered to teach English classes in our sort of for the adults at the community center. And so, it was like me and 8 or 9 of these folks. And, and of course, the war invariably came up quite frequently. People would say, there used to be an American prisoner of war camp nearby. And so I would go pilgrimage out on the weekends and try to find that. And then, I remember one night, one of the women talked about the fire bombings of Kobe, and she had been in there during that time. Of course, and that's the subject of the book I've just wrapped up. And so it just really piqued my interest. And so then with some friends, I road trip down to Hiroshima and one weekend.
Wow.
And so I saw the atomic dome and all that there. And then literally about a week or two later, my parents were going to be in Hawaii. And so I was flying down to Hawaii to meet them. And my dad was a retired naval officer. And so, of course, the first stop we made was Pearl Harbor. So within the span of literally 2 weeks, I saw sort of what bookended America's experience in World War II, Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. And it just, it was just like something clicked. And so I ended up as a journalist for a little while after that, newspaper journalist for about 6 or 7 years. And then when I started writing books, I had the opportunity. My editor at the time said, what do you want to write about now? And I said, I'm interested in World War II. And
what was his reaction to that? Was he like, oh no, or was he like, oh great, cool?
Already a whole library.
Well, no, I'd just done my first book, which was about my dad. And so my father was a young naval officer on the USS Liberty, which was a spy ship that was sent into the Middle East. It was part of this mobile listening platform that it was operated by the Navy and the NSA at that time. And so they were sent in. You may remember the Pueblo, which was captured by North Korea. It was kind of one of the sister ships in the same program. And so the Liberty was sent into the Middle East, and it was attacked by the Israelis. And 34 Americans were killed, and over 170 were injured. And my dad was the damage control officer. And so, it was his job that day to kind of keep the ship from sinking. So that was the subject of my first book. And so when I finished that up, my editor actually goes, well, what interests you now? And I said, submarines, World War II. And so I literally pitched The War Below with a 3-page synopsis of what I wanted to do. And my editor was like, all right, we'll do it. Let's do it. And so, which was a blessing and a curse in a lot of ways, because I sort of sold an idea without a narrative. And so, I've got this idea that all right, I want to write about submarines. I've always been fascinated by them since, being a kid and going to the Charleston Naval Base. But I don't have a story. I don't have an arc that I want to tell. And I struggled a lot with that book because I had to figure out, because of all the characters sort of come and go throughout the war and on different boats, how do you string that together and yet also tell the story of the totality of the war, the 1,347 days of, and so that, and so I learned a lesson after that. I said, after that, every book's going to have sort of a traditional narrative arc. So I did the Doolittle Raid, I did the Battle of Manila, I did the firebombing of Tokyo. So, but the War Below was just a totally fascinating, because it allowed me to sort of nerd out on all the things I'd grown up being curious about and interested about with submarines. So
I know.
I'm picturing. I'm picturing being in the drum with a tape measure, and kids and dads are walking through. Now, be careful! Don't step on that torpedo. Oh, watch out! This nice man's measuring something.
Well, I did the same thing on the silver side. So, which is a museum ship as well up in Muskegon, Michigan. And I went up there in February one year, and of course, there's snow drifts 20 feet high, and the lake is totally frozen over. And
he's got out his laser level.
Yeah. Well, but what was so awesome for there is I got to go sit in the room where the appendectomy took place. I went into the wardroom, and right there, here's the table where this legendary surgery takes place. And so, it was it's hallowed ground, to get to go on those boats.
And there's a picture of it right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, we're lucky that there are a number of these World War II boats still around, that people are able to go and visit them. You've got the Pompano in San Francisco, the Razorback in Little Rock. You've got, the Bowfin is in Hawaii. Fortunately, a number of these boats are still around.
And yet, sometimes, especially as we've learned through COVID, I think, especially we historian, buffs or military fanatics, whatever you want to call us, we sometimes take some of those museums for granted because we've been there so many times, but they so heavily rely on the donations people make when they visit. And so, thank God, especially when it comes to some of those larger crafts, that there's groups out there to help provide the funding to maintain that stuff. But with that being said, we all need to remind ourselves occasionally to get out to the smaller mom and pop ones, because I know we lost 2 of them here during COVID just because when everybody shut down, their revenue stream just stopped completely, and their rent kept coming in, and sadly, a lot of them had to either close. Like one of our big ones was the Southwest Florida Military Museum and Library, and one of the cool things they did, they actually started out just as a group of veterans who would help other veterans with their filing their claims, and they would feed vets on Wednesday, and people just start donating things to them until they finally had to rent out an old grocery store. But due to COVID and the lack of visitors, they're now in what used to be the Disney store in our mall. They've actually gone down that small to what used to be a grocery store with Jeeps inside, motorcycles, to what used to be a Disney store because COVID just about crushed them.
I'm hoping we can come back from all that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so how many, I think there were like 36 archives and libraries that had records that you used for the War Below. Did you go to every one of those?
Yeah, I went to most of them, and I may have used a research assistant here or there if it was a little off the, or if it was one, collection I needed that an archivist could copy and send to me. But the challenge is, and one of the reasons this one was so labor intensive was because you're looking for the personal papers.
Yeah, right.
And of course, those are your major sources of papers and things like that are going to be National Archives and stuff like that. But when you're starting to look for so and so's letters and things like that, so often families leave them to their local historical societies. And people don't realize, these can be gold mines for when you're searching for these stories. This person lived in Charleston, South Carolina, for example, where I am, and they did a bunch of oral histories with the local historians, and all those things land in the historical society. That's where you're going to go to find those things. So, that's kind of part of the historical scavenger hunt, that goes into these projects. But that's also the fun of it, hunting them down and tracking them down. And thankfully, we have tools like the internet and WorldCat and places like that that can help facilitate that.
When you were researching your books, did you come across any, when researching the contents for the submarine, did you come across any personalized complaints, concerns, or issues with what some may argue, the hated MK-14 torpedoes and the nonsense? I just learned about those. I'm currently reading The Fatal Dive, which is the solving the World War II mystery of the USS Grunion, I think you pronounce it. And there's a whole chapter on the MK-14s, and that's the whole thing's new to me. And
yeah, that's a big issue. The whole bad torpedoes was and it really hampered the submarine's war effort in the first year and a half of the war. And because essentially you had these skippers coming back that were reporting to their supervisors saying, hey, I was right on this Japanese ship, and you pull the trigger and nothing happened, and something's wrong. We've got a bad weapon. And you had the guys with the gun club at the Bureau of was the ordnance saying, no, it's your skippers are bad shots. And so you had these competing narratives. And
because the money was already spent. They were committed.
I mean, people have to remember, a torpedo is a complex weapon. I mean, these things are not, I think a lot of people that don't know the ins and outs of it just think it's kind of like this underwater rocket, when the reality is it's essentially a small submarine. It's got twin propellers. It has alcohol that it runs off as a fuel and everything. And they were designed so they could run underneath the keel of a ship, detect the change in the magnetic field, and then detonate. And so for the 1940s, this was pretty sophisticated machinery. And of course, it was put in action without enough trial work. But it took having an admiral like Charles Lockwood, who was a submariner at heart, to decide with his men and say, you know what, we're going to run some tests on these. And so he did just that down in Australia with a bunch of fishing nets and things like that. And sure enough, you realize that these things were running way too deep.
Not only are they running way too deep, but there's been reports of the occasional circlebacks. So not only were they detonating, they were circling back and running feet underneath the sub that shot them. And once again, they're magnetically charged. And so not only do some of them not detonate, but some of them come right back at you like a boomerang. And okay, we have a problem here.
Yeah, we have 2 known cases of that. The Tang was one, and then the second boat escapes me, but it had one survivor. His last name was Kuykendall, and who had survived that. And of course, he walked out of a prison camp at the end of the war, having been rescued. But we don't know. I mean, literally almost 1 out of every 5 boats lost. We don't know why a lot of them went down. It could have been others that brought them back as well. And of course, that's a terrifying thing because, the submarine is literally the size of a football field. And at the time you're taking your shot, you're hardly moving. And so suddenly this thing's porpoising back around and circling back like on a boomerang. You don't have any, speed to be able to maneuver, and you're just a huge target for it.
And they never knew what caused them to boomerang back when it happened, the circle backs.
No, I think just the malfunctioning. I mean, because it was, those were just the reported cases we had of it. And there's nothing really to study after that.
And not only that, but as the captain of the vessel, you're like, okay, I got X amount of torpedoes, but out of those, X amount are MK-14s that I really don't want to shoot. And so now it's almost like being an infantryman, knowing that 8 out of the 12 M blocks I have in my belt are full of duds, or too hot, or might cause my receiver to blow up in my face.
Yeah, I mean, it had a total demoralizing effect on a lot of these skippers, and a lot of guys that were really talented and potentially could have offered a lot walked away and said, "You know what? I'll take the desk job. Get me out. It must be me." And it demoralized a whole wave of these guys. So.
They had what, 24 torpedoes in the racks for a patrol? Wasn't that standard?
Yep.
Talk about choosing your shot and not being, quick on the trigger. I mean, and that's more periscope time. That's more time being potentially observed. That's more time being in depth charge range. And so
you got to remember, I mean, too, like when you leave Pearl Harbor, I mean, to get from Pearl Harbor to Japan is like almost 2 weeks.
Wow.
So, I mean, you're going 3,500 miles across the ocean there.
What was
just to deliver these 24 torpedoes? And so all that time, all that fuel, all that energy spent for it to not work. And of course, in the early stages of the war, the Japanese were incredibly confident that they didn't use escorts. They just sent their ships out. I mean, it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, and yet, you're shooting blanks.
What was the average submerged speed of a sub back then? I mean, it wasn't very fast at all.
No, I'll tell you, the subs back then. So it's important to remember. I mean, they were really more like submersibles. I mean, these things were designed they were simply surface ships that could dive. And so when they ran on the surface, they used diesel engines. And then when they dove, they switched over to battery power. And so the battery power, which these batteries were huge. I mean, the entire basement well really of the boat was filled with these cells. And but they could run, if they ran at 8 knots, they would burn out their batteries in 1 hour.
Jeez.
And 2 knots, they could go for 24 to 48 hours essentially. So when a submarine would, a lot of times they would, and that's why a lot of these skippers realized that you wanted to attack at night on the surface, because you could sneak in at night. The Japanese were not early adopters of radar like we were, so they really used lookouts. So you had this natural cover of darkness, so you could sneak in pretty close You could line up the shots you wanted. You sort of wait for the enemy to maneuver in a position that was favorable to you. Take the shot, and then you could just hightail it out of there at full speed on the surface, which you're running 21, 22 knots at that point, and be gone before the Japanese destroyers could ever catch you. And so what a lot of these skippers realize is that, when you first saw a Japanese ship in the morning, for example, and they would scan the coastlines, and they loved the ones that used coal and stuff like that because they left these black clouds. And that's when they became hunters. And so they would watch that, and then they would, figure out what they were, figure out the position and also the course. And then they would just track them kind of like a wolf to its prey until nightfall. And then a lot of times you wait all night until after the moonfall until that you get them at that darkest point of the night. And then you can kind of come in and make your kill. And so that was kind of what the excitement of it. So throughout that entire day, you'd be on board this boat. All the sailors they would know that they had their prey figured out. And it was all about, just waiting and biding your time and getting that right position. Now, the other challenge, if you didn't attack at night and you were attacking during the day, for example, and you had to dive and the Japanese escorts were all over you dropping depth charges, you can't run away underwater at 8 knots and burn out your batteries. So it really required these skippers to have strategies. So, you would dive down several hundred feet, and then you had to sort of anticipate how you would move. And some of these guys would sort of spiral out from their position that they were in at 2 knots, where you would go in one direction, then change course and go in the other and try to. So it became sort of this cat and mouse underwater. And all of that, of course, is what made it so much more conducive for these guys to attack at night. And that was a lot of the learning that they had to figure out on the job, because when the war started, all these guys had been, they were peacetime skippers having to learn how to fight in this new war and develop these tactics and these strategies.
And to do that blindly, with the exception of your one periscope, which you can't use when you're submerged, and open water is scary enough. But when I was reading The Lonely Vigil about the coast watchers of the Solomon Islands, the amount of rescue missions that these subs were doing to pick up, whether they're pilots, missionaries, allies, these guys were like going submerged right off the coast of these islands, not knowing exactly where the obstruction and the coral reefs were, because the charts they had were 100 years old from guys who marked it with with the Twain rope and all that stuff. It's like you have no windows. You have you go out. Could you imagine? I always loved the time machine game. Whenever you're having a bad day off, I got in a time machine, went back to the front lines in a foxhole. Any one of those guys that happily trade me for my problems. Could you imagine just time machine game, picking up a skipper from a submarine, 1943, put them down on your local fishing vessel, say, check out this Garmin that shows me where my fish are at. That reminds me, boy, they got side scans. We can see cinder blocks on the bottom of the ocean. You can see the new Garmin or Hummingbird, pick your depth finder on any fishing vessel, is just the little cheap $140 Garmin depth finder I have on my kayak. They would love to have 82 years ago. They're working off of pings and blips in a windowless vessel off the coast of these islands, not knowing if they're going to puncture, scrape along a sharp, jagged coral or a mine. Just to do all that blind, to me, is just so insane.
Wasn't it on the Silver Size in New Guinea when literally one of the officers had a school atlas that they had to copy for a picture of the port or something? They didn't even know which harbor.
They were taking measurements. They were having to do their navigation by the stars. It's like, nowadays, like my watch has more horsepower in it than in intellectual capacity than this entire submarine did. Everything about it was that way. And so, but yeah, and you have to remember too, in the Pacific, a lot of those are volcanic islands. And so you've got all sorts of these underwater obstructions and things like that. And, we still don't know why some of these boats didn't come back. And it may very well be that they
bumped into something.
Into these things. Exactly.
Well, going back to the maps, like Henry was saying, before we invaded Guadalcanal, we were pulling up maps from Guadalcanal from adventure books from 80 years before. It's we had nothing. This book has a map of Guadalcanal that came out in 1857, and here's a couple of plantation guys who did some palm tree work. That's all we had when we came up with Operation Watchtower.
You got Captain Cook's maps, right?
Yeah, right. Let's go down to the local bar and find a drunkard who used to run a plantation 5 years ago and see if he's willing to put on a pith helmet and send some scouts out and help us out. You know, what's the old saying? Necessity is the mother of invention. And,
Totally.
and we quickly rolled out some new technology then. You know,
were there, so looking at the sub-war in total, I mean, were there a lot of boats? Because like I said, I'm halfway through the book, so I haven't gotten to the end. How many of these things didn't come back? Is there even a known number?
Yeah, I think it was 52 of the boats, as I recall.
50, Jesus.
Out of the 288 that served. So, I mean, you know, you did have a huge losses. And so, like I was saying earlier, you know, too, when a boat was lost, I mean, typically it was all hands on board. I mean, because, you know, there's very little opportunity for people to get off.
When I was at Auburn in college, I minored in German, and my German teacher was a lady whose father-in-law had been a U-boat crewman. And I looked it up because even in college, I was really into World War II history, not as much as I became so later in life. But out of like 32,000 German U-boat crewmen in World War II, I think 7,000 made it home.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to, and I knew her, she was a super nice lady, but I really wanted to spend more time just talking to her. Like, man, your father-in-law must have had, of course, he probably didn't want to talk about it, but.
Yeah, I mean, they lost hundreds. I mean, like 700, I think. I mean, it was a crazy, I mean, that was a death wish being a German, particularly later in the war. I mean, because our anti-submarine technology was phenomenal compared to theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it was just a death wish.
But to go back to the American experience, I mean, to Don's point of view, you're basically operating blind. I mean, think about your sound guy.
Yeah.
Think about how much you rely on his ears. I can't even imagine how you take a person and train them to, it's just mind-boggling to me. I mean,
no, I mean, it's an art form, and you know, these guys, I mean, that you depend on these guys to get it right.
You know, we talked about one of the things that attracts Henry and Jeff to aviation is the fact that these guys are in these cans up in the air, but worst case scenario, you have a halfway decent chance of escaping in a parachute. Submarine, it's even less. I mean, to crawl down that hatch and know that you're going on a battle run, I can only imagine. No, I couldn't. I couldn't even imagine what those crewmen, you know, your entry level cats, your privates and all that, think about when they're sitting on that bunk after the hatch closes and they take off. It's just, I don't even know. I couldn't even start to wrap my mind around that.
Yeah, I think one of the best approximations, the best ideas we have of it is to look at the experience of what went wrong and what it was like for the men on the Tang, which of course, you know, was one of the boats that was lost, but in which a number of the crewmen did get off. And, you know, of course, they were stuck 180 feet underwater, and, you know, in a wounded submarine. I mean, this thing didn't just suddenly fill up with water right away. I mean, it was, parts of it were on fire underwater.
You got diesel fuel.
Most of these men ended up in the one of the torpedo rooms there that had the escape chamber. And, you know, once the batteries caught on fire, the black smoke and the fumes and so it's seeping in there, and you imagine sort of the dim lights and the fog in there, and it's sapping your energy, and it's demoralizing. I mean, it's truly a terrifying experience, and it goes on literally for several hours until finally, you know, most of these men ultimately pass out from lack of oxygen and die. And so, but we have those glimpses from those few men who fought against that exhaustion and everything else to get off, to kind of get a sense of just how awful that experience was.
Mm-hmm.
That's the terror. That's what you lived in fear of, is being stuck underwater in a burning, gas-filled submarine, unable to get off. I mean, it's terrifying.
Is there much out there, James, on the Japanese experience, the Japanese submarine experience? Submariner?
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese, you know, one thing I was, the Japanese just completely mismanaged their undersea war. I mean, they were convinced all along that World War II was going to be won with this great sea battle. I mean, this Hollywood type scene, and they would win, without recognizing that and that they should have fought the exact same type of war against us that we were fighting against them, which of course, you know, look, for every time you come ashore in the Philippines or the Mariana Islands, I mean, they're literally hundreds, if not thousands of American boats and transports and supplies and all that kind of stuff coming in. All of those are rich targets. All those are ways that, American supply lines can be cut off. And the Japanese never realized that. And the Germans were constantly telling them, you guys need to do to the Americans what they're doing to you. And they were like, no, we're going to fight this one great sea battle. And of course, by the end of the war, they were really desperate to have this great win of some sort to give them a better position at the negotiating table, which of course never came. But knock on wood for the United States, they never realized their errors until it was far too late. So,
could you really even say that like their strategy for their I boats, I guess is what they call them in the war, was not to go after our freighters and tankers and juicy soft targets, but always trying to go after warships?
Exactly. And they had no strategy as far as look, you saw by the time World War II breaks out, the U.S. is making one type of boat. We're just hammering these suckers out like 10 a month by 1944. We have figured out our strategy. We have figured out how we're going to fight these boats, and we are now mass producing them. And the Japanese are still making everything from little tiny midget boats to these massive boats that literally had float planes on board.
Yeah.
And so that represented this idea. It's like sending a kid into a toy store and he just grabs everything he wants without understanding what his activity is going to be. And that's the difference between the United States and the Japanese, that we were lucky that we had these really awesome submarine officers who studied what happened in World War I, learned those lessons from it. We got hold of all the German submarines. We took them all apart. We figured out why their engines were better, their optics were better, their hulls were better. We then set out to re-engineer a boat that would work for us. We also knew as early as, literally before the smoke even cleared from World War I, that we were likely going to fight a war on the far side of the Pacific. So we had to build a boat that would work for that type of conflict. And so, we wisely used that time between the two wars, and the Japanese just didn't. And it came back to haunt them with a vengeance.
Well, and look at, like, if you look at the Solomons campaign, early on, look as early as 1942 or of course, by early 43, Guadalcanal was a lost cause for them. But I think it was on an episode of World War II TV, and I can't remember who the guest was, but, Woody, what Paul Woodad said, what else do you need to illustrate a complete failure of your strategy than you're using submarines to supply your infantry?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be an offensive forward deployed weapon going after targets, and you're using it as a supply boat.
Yeah. No, a submarine's a killer in the story. It is designed purely as an offensive weapon, and they just didn't get it. Again, to their detriment.
Well, and we've mentioned on episodes in the past, I think a lot of that had to do with the I don't want to say interdepartmental, but inter-military rivalry that the Japanese had between each branches. Like the Navy wanted to be the end-all, be-all. The Army, as we said before, the Japanese Empire Army wasn't aware that their Navy was building the airstrip on Guadalcanal until, I guess we got to come help, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Whoever started that construction, the rest of the military had no idea. And so I think a lot of that, you're asking about what was the Japanese experience like. Well, we also know that they weren't exactly forthcoming and honest with their numbers losses, because they wanted to put up the appearance that they were winning the war better than they actually were.
Very true.
It's hard to come through. It's hard to come across accurate, detailed descriptions of losses, and whether it's tonnage, vehicles, or human life.
Yeah. Yeah, and they were hung up fighting the last war, which frequently happens, and then without realizing that this war was going to be not one of battleships, but it was going to be fought under the waves and in the heavens. It was going to come into naval aviation and submarines, and bombardment, Army aviation on that end. So, whoops. I hate to say it.
Before we wrap up this episode, is there one particular thing that you discovered when researching the war below about the submarines, or even the personnel, that just kind of blew your mind, or maybe you weren't anticipating being part of that lifestyle, or even, just that warfare? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I'll say, for starters, I was able to interview a lot of World War II veterans for this, because, again, I was working on this book, almost 15 years ago, I think. And so I had some wonderful friendships with the guys that I really cherish. And I'll say, one of the things that it was interesting is I do think that the Great Depression played shaping the type of men that could handle a war like this. Because, and some of the guys and everyone I interviewed, I asked them, I said, what was your experience in the Depression like? And a lot of them were really, really difficult. I mean, their parents had died. One of them, his father, they'd struggled through poverty and whatnot. So, I mean, they were already hardened by that struggle, so that for them, going on board a submarine, which by our standards today would just seem like incredibly austere, tight, and fine, for them was a luxury. And it took that type of experience, I think, to make them into the type of men that could fight these weapons. And they did. And so that was one of the things I think that really stood out to me when I was doing the research, was just kind of how they were so defined by that time period, that it helped them in this war.
It's interesting. You're talking about how living through the Depression made them as durable and willing to do the things that they did. And it always reminds me of a video I saw about 2 years ago where a young lady in her early 40s, she posted a picture of some housewives in the late 60s. They're all probably 40, 42. And she was like, look at all these women. They're my age, but they look so much older. They look so, what is the difference between us now and then? It's like, well, because they were born and raised during the Depression. They lived through World War II. Their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their cousins were off dying. They lived through stress. They didn't have the medicines we had, but just that lifestyle, that hard, rugged lifestyle. And not to mention that most of that generation, a large proportion of them, were farmers. They were out working in the sun every day. They weren't in air-conditioned cubicles typing away on a typewriter all day. Sure, some of them were, but a majority of our country still relied heavily on local and mom-and-pop farmers, and they were outside working in the weather.
Absolutely. Much more rural society than we are today. No doubt about it.
Well, James, I want to thank you for coming on. Your new book, Black Snow, I believe is released on September 6th of 2022. Is that correct? Coming up shortly? Yep. And you can pre-order right now on Amazon. Let's see, Black Snow, Curtis LeMay, The Firebombing of Tokyo and the Road to the Atomic Bomb by our friend here, James M. Scott. Once again, you can pre-order that now on Amazon and anywhere else you can find your finer books. And we're going to have James on here again, I think 2 weeks from now. We're going to do a round 2. And
I think it's going to be past that because James, you're going to Italy. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I leave Wednesday for Italy, and I get back that Monday the 1st. I think it's the 8th is what I have down on my calendar.
Is that a pleasure trip, or are you researching your new Mussolini book?
No, I'm going to be teaching my kids about ancient Rome, Pompeii, all the good stuff.
Before we wrap up,
have you got something picked out for after Black Snow? I mean, is there going to be another World War II book? Please tell me there is.
Well, you'll find out soon enough. I'm writing a proposal right now. So.
Okay.
Always leave them wanting more, Henry. Henry, before we wrap it up, you got anything you want to plug?
No, the only thing that article I wrote for World War II magazine is hitting on August 8th, I think, is when that issue comes out. So that's it.
Awesome.
Fantastic. And James, do you have anything else you want to plug before we wrap this up?
No, just thanks, guys, for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Any social media places people can track you down? Twitter, Instagram, Facebook?
I'm on Twitter more than I am at Instagram. I've got a Facebook authors page and website, jamesmscott.com. So for updates.
We want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Please do us a favor and head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. Click on that orange Patreon link, sign up. It's $1 a month. That goes a long way to help support the overhead for the shows we do here at the Digital 410 Network. And while you're at WTSPWorldWar2.com, you can click on the appearance page, and you can see the episodes of World War II TV that Henry was on. You can see the episodes of History Behind the Page that Jeff was on, and myself with Sarah the History Chick, who I believe will be on next week to talk about the USS Indianapolis. But thank you guys so much for your continued support, and we will talk to you all next week.
Digital 410 Productions.
This has been a Digital 410 production.